Okay, I think we've already got everyone introduced, and people on the panel wanted to make some brief, very brief introductory remarks, tell us a little bit about what they're working on. So why don't we start with Keith?
Okay, we got these in there. Okay, I wanted just to start out with presenting a couple of slides that look at some long-term trends which I think illustrate or help illustrate a transition to a knowledge-based or a science-based growth in agriculture. So this first chart shows some global trends in population and agricultural production and cropland area since 1900. And the interesting thing here is that we've been able to increase per capita food supply substantially with only very small changes in total global cropland area. Now, of course, in some areas of the world, cropland is still expanding. In other areas, it's been shrinking. But that's the picture overall. And that has allowed, of course, substantial, the improvement in the global diet, in particular the increased consumption of animal products per capita, and saving a lot of land resources. But it's also raised a lot of concerns about how is that intensification of land use coming from, and is that also doing damage to the environment, because at least part of that has been due to application of industrial inputs to agriculture. So if we focus just on the period since 1960 or 61, we can get a better picture of how knowledge-based growth has begun to also substitute for the use of industrial inputs in agriculture to sustain growth without increasing what we call factors of production. So we call this, when we look at, so what the chart tries to do is the top line there on total inputs, or total outputs, that's the same line as we saw previously, but just from 1961 on, and the shaded areas under that show the increases in land, labor, and capital, including the contribution in blue there of what we could call land improvement or extending irrigation to cropland. But that gap there, which I label TFP, that's the increase in output beyond the use of these inputs. So that's what we call increases in total factor productivity. And that's really based on application of new technologies, better farming practices, specialization and scale, all these things that raise the efficiency of those inputs used and it depends directly on investments in research and development to generate those changes. Now, so that's a global picture, and you can see that since 1990, I mean, that's really been driving growth in the world agricultural economy. Not all countries of the world are on this science-based growth path, but certainly the United States and Brazil are largely there now. And to the extent that this can be what Karen and the ambassador talked about earlier in their remarks, that this is a way to sustain productivity growth in a way that conserves environmental resources.
Thanks, Keith. I think, Claudia, you were going to go next in the opening remarks, as I recall.
Now, you're a little bit out of order here. So. There's yours.
Yeah, so first I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. As you've heard, I'm with the International Food Policy Research Institute, so we focus very much on global food security, and obviously how agriculture is produced is a key question, but we also, of course, focus on the environmental impacts. And as we've already heard this morning, between 2010 and 2050, we kind of need a production growth of about 60%, not even to meet everyone's food demands, but to meet effective demand, to meet the demand of those who can actually afford food. As we know, a lot of people still don't have enough income and resources to afford food. So that's another story that we have to urgently address. But here now, in terms of agricultural production, environmental implications. So even, we've heard from Keith that we focus much more on the knowledge component of agriculture production. Despite this, we of course still use a lot of inputs. Most of our production still relies on land, of course land, water, chemicals, and those various inputs have various environmental impacts depending on how you use them, where you use them, and how efficiently you use them. So the key question really is, how can we minimize environmental impacts while continuing to achieve this very impressive agricultural production growth that Brazil has achieved over the last decades? There's basically two general schools of thought. One is intensification, which is the path that Brazil has taken, also the United States. The path actually that most other countries in the world are trying to achieve, but generally have challenges because of lack of research capacity. So Brazil is a very big exception, very large research capacity and very much focus on technological change. Other countries still generally focus more on area expansion. That is the alternative pathway, so-called low-input agriculture, where you really try to increase agricultural production by expanding land. What are some of the environmental impacts from these two alternative schools? So the key, of course, I think also very much in everyone's mind, given recent fires in the Amazon region, is land expansion and deforestation. So the focus on low-input agriculture generally is much more associated with deforestation and expansion of land into, what might have been much more productive, biodiverse lands before, for example, if it would be the Brazilian Amazon. And not only the expansion and deforestation could be an environmental impact, but also the related soil degradation and the biodiversity loss. Another big impact or another big environmental challenge that we have to deal with any agricultural production is both water depletion, so that we use more water than is being replenished through rainfall, and water pollution. So just 10 years ago, we were working with a student from Brazil who has been trying to model the water pollution of a reservoir eutrophication that got affected by sugarcane residue reapplication on agricultural fields. So bagasse was flowing into the reservoir. Reservoir was supposed to be used for drinking water. So water is being used for many purposes. So we have to be able to keep the source available, not just for agriculture, but also for other uses. And of course, the other big, I guess, over the last 10, 15 years, more important environmental impact are carbon losses and greenhouse gas emissions. So again, depending on how we produce agriculture, we have differential impacts. And this one slide I've put here shows alternative pathways for agricultural futures in Latin America. And it just shows two of those many, many environmental impacts that are being produced as a result of increased agricultural production. I think at the top, I believe I have nitrogen emissions. And at the bottom, biodiversity risks, which is largely from land expansion. So the nitrogen emissions are obviously associated with agriculture intensification, so a high input pathway. And you can also see I have a business as usual scenario on the far left, and it moves with more trade liberalization, which obviously benefits Latin America, which, because of its very rich natural resources, has a comparative advantage to export yet more food. So we see an increase in nitrogen emissions. But again, if we focus on not just intensification, but sustainable intensification with two alternative scenarios, one focusing on precision agriculture, where we really optimize input use, especially agriculture chemical use. Or alternatively, we develop crops that are more nutrient efficient, which is also a very important additional pathway that we hope we can make more progress on. If we're able to switch from a straight intensification to a sustainable intensification pathway, we can dramatically reduce nitrogen emissions. The one other example is the bird species richness risk, because Latin America is such a large host of bird species richness. So what we have found in those scenarios that depending again, if you focus on the extensification pathway, low input agriculture, which is on the far right, you see a much larger loss of bird species richness, and you don't see as much when you focus on intensification. And those are crops, and the same situation, of course, actually more so applies to livestock expansion. Of interest here is that the highest, where we see expansion in agriculture in the future in Latin America is actually largely in central, southern, eastern Brazil and northern Argentina. And that affects about 35% of bird species richness in Latin America. So there is definitely a great risk, and we can do a lot more to address that. But at the same time, 60% of the bird species richness on the continent is not affected because of the focus and of the much larger potential of expansion in those regions of Latin America. So it's a story we have to do more about, but it's also a positive story because while focusing on those areas of the continent, we should be able to preserve 60% of the bird species richness. And those are just a few comments on the environment I wanted to make.
We'll go a little further soon. Geraldo, you were going to make a couple of...
Just speak, okay. Well, first of all, good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here in Washington again. And we've been discussing Brazilian agriculture, so very quickly background. I'm not sure if you are aware, but in the 60s, Brazil received food donations from abroad. Up to early 80s, Brazil was one of the major food importers in the world. And nowadays, Brazil is second only to the US in terms of agricultural exports. And what happened is that Brazil transformed its agriculture from a traditional agriculture to a science-based agriculture. Embrapa is the research arm of the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture. Embrapa was established in 1973. And up to 1985, Embrapa sent abroad perhaps 75–80% of its young researchers to be trained in the US. So basically, in the first 12–13 years, Embrapa sent 1,000 researchers abroad. Here in the US, Karen, I don't remember very well, but I think Raghu said that Embrapa sent around 100 young researchers to be trained at Purdue. Thank you so much for that. And those guys, they returned to Brazil with the mission to lead this transformation in Brazilian agriculture. We focused on three main pillars. The first one was to transform the acidic, low chemical fertility soils of the Cerrado. You know, in the 60s and 70s, a few consultants said, forget the Cerrado region, you know. The best case scenario, you can have a good subsistence agriculture here, and look what? Is one of the bread baskets in the world nowadays because we put science in that. The other major transformation, the other major focus was the tropicalization of crops. So, for example, soybean in the 60s, it could only be cultivated in the southern part of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul. And nowadays, as we have transformed the soybean plant, actually we can plant soybean close to the line of the equator. And the third part, Brazil invested heavily in a huge platform of sustainable agricultural practices. I'm not sure if you are aware, but nowadays in Brazil we have 35 million hectares under no-till planting. And also we have now the so-called crop livestock systems, the integration between crops and livestock in the same system. I will go back shortly to that. But how this strategy worked for Brazil. And in the slide here, you have a very small picture of that. You can see that up to mid-80s, the growth in productivity, they were very slow, with a few exceptions. But again, after mid-80s, Brazil moved really fast forward, and it increased the productivity not only for soybean or corn, but for all major crops and also for beef cattle. Actually, beef is it's actually not little, it's a super interesting thing. From 1950 up to 1975, productivity growth in beef cattle in Brazil grew by 0.3% a year. Nothing. From 1975 to 1996, the productivity grew by 3.3% a year. Nicer. And then from 1996 to 2006, beef productivity in Brazil increased by 6.64% per year, like almost a Chinese growth in terms of productivity. But the key point here is that because Brazil has this broad productivity growth in several crops and also in beef cattle. The next slide, please. By increasing productivity, Brazil was able to generate a huge land-saving effect. What is this land-saving effect? Imagine that you have now a technology that you can produce 3 tons per hectare of corn. If you want to produce 9 tons, for example, you're going to need 3 of those hectares, right? But now imagine that you change the technology, and instead of producing 3 tons per hectare, you are now able to produce 9 tons per hectare. So you're not going to need 3 hectares anymore, you just need 1. Compared to the old technology that you need 3, you spared 2 hectares of cultivation. So the picture on your right is showing that with crops, because of the productivity gains, Brazil spared 220 million hectares of hectares from cultivation. So this is huge. And just for you to have an idea, actually, more or less the same figure, instead of 220 million, 214 million, was spared because of the productivity gains here in the US. And this is what's happening in Americas, the science-based approach that is so very important. And then in green, you have the land-saving effect arising from beef productivity growth in Brazil, and that amounted a little bit more than 600 million hectares. So put together, we are talking that because of productivity gains in Brazil, we almost spared another Brazil. And this is a huge contribution to the environment, as you can see on your right. We have 2 different sources. On the top showing that 66% of this huge territory that is Brazil is still covered with native vegetation. And on the bottom, on your right, you have another source, an NGO, that find a little bit more. 68% of the Brazilian territory is still covered with native vegetation. Key point here, 2/3 of this huge territory in Brazil is covered with native vegetation, and that was only possible because of the science-based approach that Brazil has chosen to move on. And the next slide. Okay, and how much incentive did Brazilian agriculture needed to accomplish those amazing goals? And here comes a very exciting thing. OECD has a metric for incentives in agriculture. This metric is called Producer Support Estimate. And on average, from 1995 to 2017, Brazilian farmers received 1.6% of gross farms revenue. 1.6%, almost nothing. China in the same period on average received 8.6%. US farmers received 13.5%, European farmers 27%, and if you go to Asia countries such as Japan and South Korea, this is close to 60% of incentives. The key point here is that Brazilian farmers, they are pretty much exposed to market signals, and they are going to adopt new technologies if they had the perception that technology is going to pay, because they don't receive almost nothing in terms of subsidies. And my last slide. Okay, and what is the potential for the future? If we follow a trend line, our ambassador has highlighted the potential will be like 300 million tons of the major crops. But what is actually the potential if you use the genetic potential already in the country, and eventually we consider that we can expand a little bit of our cropland over our pasture land? For example, over the past 2 decades, 20-30 million hectares perhaps were increased in terms of croplands in Brazil, 80% of that amount over pasture land. So Brazil has this potential to increase cropland without pressuring native vegetation. Well, keeping it short, if Brazil uses its whole genetic potential, technologies, and expand a little bit of the land over pasture land, the potential, it will be 460 million tons of grains and soybeans, and sugarcane, it goes to over 1 billion tons. It's huge, the potential of Brazil. And one final thought, and is the table in the bottle. You're going to see that agricultural production in Brazil is highly concentrated. Basically, 13% of the farmers in Brazil, they account for 88% of the agricultural product in Brazil. And guess what? This is exactly the same picture here in the US and actually the same picture in Europe. So basically, a small share of farmers account for a huge portion of the agricultural product. In the case of Brazil, 68% of the income in farms comes already from technology, 68%. Land accounts for a little bit less than 10% and labor a little bit more than 20%. So the point here is that we can make a huge transformation in terms of increasing output if we can bring those farmers that are not being able to adopt technology today and then they can adopt technology that is already being used by other farmers in Brazil. So this can be actually a disruptive transformation in Brazilian agriculture. And one example that we can highlight will be the second panel in terms of digital agriculture, but also, for example, the crop livestock integration that we have in Brazil. Depending on the region, we can have 3 harvests or 3 crops per year without irrigation. We can have a short cycle soybean, then we harvest the soybean, and like 7-10 minutes later, we start planting the corn together with the grass pasture, then we harvest the corn, and after harvesting the corn, the pasture is established. Then we can use that pasture for cattle feeding during the dry season, and then when rain starts again, the farmer can decide that area will continue as a pasture or that area will serve as a major, fantastic soil cover for no-till planting and another cycle of soybean, for example. Thank you so much.
And then Josiah, you had some opening remarks.
Yes, thank you. And first off, thank you for the opportunity to be here and participate in this, I think, very important conversation about sustainable intensification in agriculture and how we apply science and technology and data to make our agricultural systems even more sustainable moving forward. As you heard, I'm with Corteva Agriscience. We are the largest pure-play agricultural technology company in the world. Just spun out in June following the merger of Dow and DuPont. So we think of ourselves as having more than a century of agriculture experience behind us, but we also have the mind of a startup since we're really only about 5 months old. And really having a focus on how we enrich the lives of producers and consumers, being able to focus both on the customers inside the farm gate and the customers all the way downstream who are thinking about sustainability in the food that they purchase. One of the areas where we work really strongly in Brazil is with ranchers and pasture land. We've talked a lot about beef production in Brazil, the 95% of beef production on the pastoral regime. And it's really important for Brazil because that pastoral regime allows a bunch of differentiation in terms of omega-3s, in terms of fat acid profiles. It's really important that we continue to maintain the level of productivity that we've seen. So we talked about the gains that have been made. Our focus is how do we work with ranchers, putting 900 agronomists on the ground to support ranchers to continue to make sure that ranch land, that pasture land, continues to be more productive. We've seen, just recently, we did a research study, 5 years, with highly adaptive urea, that showed us that over those 5 years, upwards of 50% to even 2/3 of the pasture land in Brazil, it was at risk of weed degradation. We've got climate change impacting us on a number of levels. We see the persistence and pervasiveness of weed species, of disease pressures, things we haven't seen before in regions because things are moving around as the weather patterns change. So our ability to come alongside with ranchers and be able to work with them providing technology on crop protection, digital technology for precision application, seed technology, enables us to take some of that pasture land that's at risk of weed degradation and convert it into 3 times as productive in terms of forage, 3 times to 5 times as productive in terms of animal units per hectare, and 5 times in terms of the gross revenue. I think there's a couple slides just kind of before and after. Go ahead, thumb through them just so people can see. But that's really kind of our focus in Brazil, not only how we are recognizing the great contribution that ranchers and the beef production system has made in terms of agriculture and sustainability intensification, but also what we're doing moving forward. Maybe they didn't make it.
Yeah.
Oh, there they are. Good work, Keith. There's a lot of out of order in the slides here. But I'll go into more details on this later, but examples of what we're doing, working with ranchers on the ground. How do we take the science and technology coming from the data coming from the research arms and apply it to make sure that ag land stays as productive as possible?
Okay, well, let's start with, but the first question that would pop into most Americans or many Americans' minds, who, particularly people who aren't agriculture focused, when they think of agriculture and Brazil, they think about the Amazon forest and some of the video we saw over the summer of all the horrible fires and encroachment on the Amazon. Geraldo, can you tell us how these issues of sustainability and productivity relate to the Amazon? And anyone else after can join in. I just thought Geraldo might be best suited to start.
Thank you. Well, I just showed for you that 2/3 of the Brazilian territory is still covered with native vegetation. And Brazil has 6 biomes, and when you go to the Amazon biome, 84% of the biome is still covered with native vegetation. Then we have what is called legal Amazon, that takes the Amazon biome and a part of the Cerrado biome. And then when you go to the legal Amazon, that is a little bit larger, instead of 84% of native vegetation, we have 81% of native vegetation. So when you are talking about Amazon in Brazil, especially the biome, it's really hard to say that a biome that is preserved with 84% of its original vegetation has been destroyed. This is simply, no, it's a simply question of math. It doesn't make sense for me. What happens is that sometimes when we are talking about the Amazon, there's a lot of, passion on that, and that's okay. Everybody wants to preserve. And I think that the strategy behind the development of Brazilian agriculture goes towards that direction. But actually, there is a very little agricultural activity in Amazon. We have actually some pastures, some beef, but they're not going into the heart, into the Amazon biome. Actually, they are mostly concentrated up to the border of the Cerrado with the Amazon. And as this border is also sometimes called as the legal Amazon, I think that perhaps this is one of the causes of confusion. So actually, the cattle is not hugely inside the Amazon biome, but it's in the border of the Amazon biome. Not sure if you want some more things, but basically it's that. When you go to the real data with the satellite data, the data generated by the Brazilian Spatial Institute, INPE, and also when you go to NASA, some of the work NASA and the US Geological Survey they are doing to map the vegetation all around the world, you see the forest almost entirely is still there.
And do these notions of improving sustainability and productivity in agriculture impact what will happen in the future there?
You see, this is curious. If you go back to the 1990s and early 2000s, there are actually a few papers in journals such as Science, such as Nature, saying that as commodity prices go up, the Amazon will be destroyed. Basically, the Amazon will collapse by 2020 or best case scenario by 2030. And what happened? Nothing that doom scenario, Actually, with better agricultural prices, the farmers, they invested more heavily in novel technologies, in new technologies, and that sort of investment make them more productive, and that higher productivity generated more land-saving effects. So they were able to increase production without encroaching into native vegetation. And of course, in the case of Amazon, we need to highlight this very important role of farmers, but also the governance in the Amazon for the past 20 years, 25 years. So it's not one single bullet, you know, it's a coordinated effort. So we have a better monitoring, a better governance, and farmers that are much more prone to adopt new technologies, and they are also seeking for these sustainable agricultural practices.
Anyone else on this? Claudia?
Maybe just quickly that, I mean, so there is obviously, I mean, Brazil has done all the right things in terms of agriculture productivity, but there are opportunities, Brazil and the US, everywhere in the world, to do yet better. And some of these, obviously some technological change, some are incentives for farmers, you know, cover cropping, use water resources differently, consider downstream water usage. So more can be done. So but I think all in all, I mean, things have been going extremely well, but there are some additional improvements on the governance or re-initiation of some of the governance structures that have worked very well. But I think the one challenge that we all face, and obviously the Brazil faces as well, is climate change. And that's where, you know, no one is really fully prepared on how to deal with I mean, we've heard the uncertainty in weather, more droughts. I mean, Sao Paulo has been also in the news a couple of years ago, Cape Town, Indian cities, everywhere in the world. No one is really fully prepared for what climate change brings. And, you know, Brazilian Amazon is a big fuel source, and we have to, I think, do a lot more thinking on how we can manage, you know, preserve forest resources in Brazil, anywhere else in the world. I live in Canada, and we have so much forest, and I'm really worried of a lot of that burning down, you know, in the not too distant future because of climate change. We have so much more drought. We have concentrated floods, and we have concentrated droughts, and they come after each other. And once we are in a concentrated drought, we have a big fuel source there. And I think we need a lot more research, not only in agriculture technology, but also on how to protect our forest resources anywhere in the world as a result of climate change. I think that's where a lot more work has to go in.
That's the next question I was thinking about.
May I just quickly complement? I think Claudia made some very important points, but I would like to remember the incentives to Brazilian agriculture are practically zero. The farmers, they are preserving 80% of their farms in Amazon without receiving any payment from the government or whatever is want to have that forest preserved. When you go to that transition between the Amazon and the Cerrado, 35% must be preserved, and again, the farmers are not receiving nothing for that. And for the remainder of Brazil, 20% of the farmers must be protected, and again, the farmers are not receiving nothing for that. And Claudia also mentioned the climate change issue, and this is taken very seriously in Brazil. I mentioned very briefly with you the integrated crop livestock systems. This is amazing. For example, because we have productive crops with productive pastures, one benefits the other. So, because of the soil chemical fertility left by crops, pastures, they can grow very quickly. What is quickly? The roots of pastures can go up to 2 meters depth in only 1 year. And when we are increasing this soil environment, actually when we are increasing soil organic matter, this means that we are capturing carbon from the atmosphere and stocking that carbon in the soil. So at the same time we are mitigating the carbon, we are mitigating emissions, but we are also increasing the system's resilience, the system's adaptation, because with more soil organic matter, especially in tropical soils, that soil is more, that soil is able to capture more water, more nutrients, and so forth, so on. So just for you to have an idea, today in Brazil we estimate that we already have 11 million hectares with those systems. This is more or less 25 million acres with those integrated crop livestock systems. So actually we are doing a lot of investments in this low carbon emission agriculture in Brazil, and we are very proud. You know, I totally agree, we have a huge avenue to go, but we are, I believe, in the right path.
Well, that question Claudia raised, I think, has been very much a broader question in the U.S. and around the world, the notion of climate change. and it's in fact involved in the presidential election in the U.S. at the moment, including agriculture's role and the impact on the environment. So I'm wondering, Claudia and maybe others as they wish, what is the environmental impact going to be of trying to increase the feeding the global population, and how is climate change going to impact it from both the standpoint of impacting the climate and the climate change impacting what farmers can do, the climate adaptation?
Yeah, just a few more words because I've already spoken to that a little bit to that. So, I mean, so the agriculture is the sector most directly affected by climate change because obviously no rainfall at the wrong time, hail, fire, whatever it is. I mean, it directly affects agriculture production. At the same time, agriculture is a key contributor to climate change, and obviously livestock production is usually singled out because it has a very large methane contribution to climate change. And again, it's an area where I'm sure you can speak to all the things that are being done and thought about. Again, I think there's a lot of thoughts, a lot of research, but certainly a lot can be done to mitigate climate change in agriculture. But what else does it do? It's more difficult to produce the same amount of food under climate change, and so you're basically producing less, which might less on the same piece of land. So you might have to do either yet more intensification or extensification. Food prices go up under a climate change, no other change scenario, which means there'll be more hungry people in the world. We estimated IFPRI about 80 million people, largely concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, where you don't have neither the good technology nor the high inputs. You have neither nor. So we need a lot of productivity growth there to help address that, or more exports from countries like the United States and Brazil. So that's what the future brings: more uncertainty in production, more effort to produce food, but also, again, going back to the Amazon and other natural regions. I mean, those are equally affected. It's not just production; it's also the natural systems, and we have less water when we want it, and so again, that affects natural systems as well. And so we have to try to preserve, to think about what we can do, not only to change agricultural production systems, some of the technologies that Geraldo has already mentioned, but also, again, how can we yet further preserve our remaining natural environment under climate change.
And just to add to that, I think there's another component to climate change, because we often think about the abiotic stress, the weather, what it does to rainfall, what it does to temperatures, but there's also the biotic stresses, the climate changing and impacting the vectors for disease, for pests. Fall armyworm is in places we never saw even 5 years ago, and we're seeing that as an impact of climate change. So farmers having to be smarter, having to be more precise in what they're doing to manage land. We think about intensification. I know words matter, and people think of intensification as higher input. I tend to think of it as high touch agriculture, and farmers really paying attention and using data and using technology to hyperactively manage that land. And precision isn't just about volumes of product, but it's also about timing. It's also about placement to make sure that we're having low input systems but increasing productivity at the same time.
Sounds good. Anyone else? Another issue that's been very much in the news in this presidential election in the United States, and Brazil and the U.S. figure extremely prominently in this, is global trade in agriculture. We've seen some recent tensions over trade. Some countries have benefited, some have not from that. Keith, maybe you can start this. What impact is this drive for sustainability and productivity and the growing population going to have on trade? And how is trade going to play out in this? How important is it going to be?
Yeah, well, trade in agriculture has been a real challenge for the world for decades. In fact, the failure of the Doha round of trade negotiations really hinged on the unwillingness of countries to open up their agricultural markets or to liberalize markets and reduce tariffs in agricultural products. And, the reason is that countries have been hesitant to sort of cede their food security to a global market. Although we know that a freer trade regime in agriculture would generate huge benefits, not only economically by making food cheaper, but also environmental benefits, because then, you know, production moves to those areas where it can be done most efficiently with the highest level of productivity. Of course, countries with strong natural resource endowments and strong research systems like Brazil and the United States would then be made, you know, even bigger players in providing that global food security. But as we think into the future, I think with climate shocks becoming more frequent, you know, trade can be a major way to mitigate those by being able to smoothen out the global supplies. But it will be a major challenge, because I think it does mean that countries need to, you know, be willing to rely on international markets, and so far there's been a lot of resistance to that in agriculture.
Anyone else on like how much trade contributes to sustainability and productivity?
I just want to emphasize the things Keith has just said, because when you go to the near future, most of the population and most of the middle class will be in the Asia-Pacific region. So actually food security will be more and more dependent on trade. So basically the question is, countries like Brazil, like the US, can they sustainably increase their productivity, their production? And here comes the thing. With a science-based agriculture, I do think it's possible, and I think this is the major challenge here for us to continue investing in agricultural research so we can provide timely solutions to the private sector, and the private sector can deliver production with sustainability.
Let me ask the whole panel, maybe we can start with Josiah. What will productive, efficient, and sustainable agriculture look like in 10 or 20 years, and what do you think is going to be perhaps the most important contributor to moving us in that direction? Maybe Josiah, you could start?
Yeah, I think Geraldo touched on this earlier. What we've seen certainly in Brazil and elsewhere is integration. We talked about crops and livestock. I could even go one farther. We just in a farm maybe half a year ago in Mato Grosso, they were integrating agroforestry and crops and livestock, growing teca production, cultivating teca trees, and working to try and figure out how do you manage the pressures around that teca cultivation. And it was, well, it's mow. It's a 550 hectare operation. Mowing is not a sustainable piece. So being able to then bring integrated solutions to those operations that are seed, that are crop protection, that are digital, start thinking in a systems approach. Not just this crop year, but let's start thinking 5 years. Let's start thinking the whole rotation, the whole integrated operation, and really bringing that to bear. Farmers are getting so smart about how they're using their land, and I think that's where we're going to start to see agriculture move. In Brazil alone, we've seen since 1977 a 340% increase in integrated systems, and that's just tremendous. And I think that's setting the standard for the rest of the world to try to follow.
One quick comment. I just mentioned that one of the key components in terms of the agricultural product is technology. And what happens in Brazil, and also I believe here in the US, is that farmers are not being able to adopt technology. So you can consider that technology like a universe of technology. When you have market imperfections, that universe shrink. So the farmer, they know that they have better technology outside their possibilities, but they simply can't adopt. So one of the key things for the future is to at least alleviate those market imperfections, and then you increase the universe of available technologies to farmers, and they can adopt better technologies. So when we are talking about market imperfection, it's big things. Go through the market itself, but also goes to better education, better infrastructure, technological and non-technological factors that will increase the possibility, that will increase the availability of technologies that farmers can adopt. Claudia?
Yeah, I mean, I very much believe in technology, and I'm generally an optimist, but I do think things will get a lot worse before they will get any better, not just because of climate change, population pressure, just because we do not invest sufficiently in agricultural research. In fact, And, you know, so there are the exceptions, United States, China, Brazil, but then there's the rest of the world. And most of the population happens to be in the rest of the world, where a population also grows fastest, such as Africa. And we have just seen, you know, 5% decline in public agricultural research in Africa, where you're like, really, you know, growth is already very, I mean, it's not the worst, but, you know, it could be so much stronger, it needs to be so much stronger. And investment is not happening. So agricultural research is not an interesting subject to any donor or any investor. I think obviously, again, exceptions, and I know Brazil has also has been working in Africa and has an interest to support Africa, but we just need to do a lot more. And given that we do not see increased trends in public agricultural research investments, obviously still there is some positive trends in private, but they can't do everything for poor people. We see growing inequity, and so I actually see a lot. I'm worried about another food price crisis where we then see the same protectionist policies coming back in. So I'm a little bit worried about the future going forward.
Keith, what will things look like in 10 or 20 years and the biggest driving force?
Well, again, I think, you know, agriculture is such a diverse field, such a diverse sector, and it's so many different technologies adopted on so many different farms, and they all accumulate up into these things we call productivity growth. It's hard to say this thing is going to really take off and be the driver. And we get surprised. I mean, I think the expansion of no-till agriculture in South America, I don't know how, you know, few people would have predicted that 20 years ago, and the tremendous impact that that's had. When I think about future productivity growth, I do sort of what Claudia was talking about. I look at what investments are being made today in research, because I think that today's investments in research are what's going to be, you know, what people are studying in the labs today is going to be what's in the field 20 years. And I have some of the same concerns that Claudia expressed, that particularly in parts of the world where poverty and population pressures are most severe, the investments in science, in a science-based path for agriculture, are not being made, particularly in Africa. And I think we have good examples from the United States and from Brazil how countries at very different levels of development can make that choice to invest in research systems and develop technologies suitable for their locations and get on that growth path. Thanks, Mike.
One last question for the panel. What is the single most important thing in each of your views that government policy can do to move this along in a positive direction in that same 10 or 20 year time frame? Maybe start with you, Josiah, out in the private sector view.
The single, yeah, I got a long list, not a single. I think what we're talking about here, can government govern from a science-based perspective when it comes to technology, when it comes to trade? I think that's the most important thing. If government can listen to the science, can respond to the science, and take that under consultation, I think, to me, that if there's going to be one, that's probably it.
Well,
I'm from an agricultural research organization, and when we consider research, research takes time to mature, research takes time to happen. Keith has just said, what is in the lab today will be in the field in 20 years. So when you go to public agricultural research, this is one of the most single important policies that a government can make. Public research is a policy. So I would say that putting more efforts in agricultural research to keep going with the challenges that will appear in the near future and the medium to long-term future is really crucial. More investments in agricultural research.
Claudia?
Yeah. Basically, Geraldo said it, but really think more about the sustainability impacts and obviously also open trade regimes. But stable investment in agricultural research, that's ideally not declining, particularly in those countries that need it most. That's the key.
Well, it gets kind of boring when everyone says we need more research, so I would say that as well.
Less research.
Right. I mean, but clearly, I think another part is, and Geraldo referred to this in the Brazilian Amazon case, the need for good governance over environmental resources and provide incentives for people to, producers and other users to conserve natural resources.
Now, did we have any time left for audience questions? Are we okay for questions from the audience? Go ahead. I think someone has a mic there. Why don't we start with this
I think I
gentleman?
can speak loud enough. I have a question on for Dr.
Oh, thanks very much. So first, let me introduce myself. I'm Dilip Sundaram. I work for a company which is the world's largest farm tractor company. And I was in Brazil like 3 weeks ago for Apex conference. I think it was a wonderful conference. And so my question is for Dr. Geraldo. What kind of work are you doing on meat substitutes? Because that has an immense impact on carbon footprint and resources and environmental degradation. So what kind of work are you doing on meat substitutes?
Embrapa has 42 research units spread all over Brazil. And our unit working with food agri-industry in Rio is developing some of those alternatives to real meat or whatever. And I think this is a very niche opportunity, but of course with a huge opportunity to growth. And we do have this kind of research, and if you want more details, I can connect you with the head of our unit in Rio, and she of course has plenty of information that I don't have right now, but we are thinking about that as well. We are developing research on that as well.
Any more questions? In back there?
Hello, this is actually a question for the panel. First of all, congratulations, it's been an amazing dialogue. I'm learning a lot. I actually have a company that focuses on facilitating and facilitating the internationalization of early stage technologies, specifically on deep tech for ag and health. I have heard a lot about the climate change and all your thoughts on it, but what do you think of the regenerative agriculture? Isn't that supposedly a new wave towards reversing the climate change? So best practices in agriculture that can actually help reverse those impacts? And what are your thoughts on that?
Who'd like to start?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. The first question is how you define regenerative agriculture. Obviously, cover cropping, increased soil carbon storage through alternative agriculture management practices. Those are all options towards mitigating climate change, but also obviously adapting to the adverse impacts of climate change. So I think, I mean, especially in locations where farmers have access to knowledge and technology and are unencumbered by some of the other distortions that some of the agricultural systems in the world have. In those locations, you will actually see a lot of this thinking setting in and actually being put into practice. So, you know, but I don't think we can completely reverse climate change. I mean, that would be great. Agriculture only contributes, you know, about a quarter, including land use change. So there are still the other 75%, and the fact that the world is not converting. I mean, as Keith said, we have this incredible diversity of agricultural production systems, and we like a diversity. We don't want everything to be the same. So we will not achieve very rapid conversion, but the thinking, I think, is starting to set in. But again, we also have to be aware that not all practices that address climate change or mitigate climate change are good for other environmental outcomes. So, you know, as I mentioned, there's a whole range of environmental outcomes that are not necessarily benefiting, including, you know, water resources don't necessarily benefit from some of the climate change regenerative practices. It really depends where, how, which crops, etc. you're looking at.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think absolutely, in terms of the regenerative agricultural practices and the potential, whether it's regenerative ag, climate smart agriculture, we call it many different things. We've just recently made an investment of $500,000 globally to accelerate adoption of regenerative and climate positive agricultural practices around the world. So we're rolling that program out next year. But it's exactly the thinking is how do we take that knowledge And how do we make that more available and accessible to producers who don't have the access to that technology or that skill set?